here today to told to hide his Chicago Bear medallion. And also the very famous former Miss Wisconsin Director of Tourism for the state of Wisconsin, Stephanie Klett, is here with us today. We wrangled her to speak too. So, as I said, this is a tremendous event, and I just have so many things to say. I don't even know where to start. I guess I'll start with how we kind of developed this project. Initially, we were actually going to tear down this building. It was an eyesore. There was storage and all kinds of junk all over, and we were looking at developing this peninsula here, and then we were, for a whole bunch of different projects we were looking at, and then we were informed that it's actually a historic building, and as such we couldn't tear it down. And I got a phone call from Laureen Wilgott, or Bookie as we call her, and she said, "Mick, you got to come over here and check out this building." And as I walked from the outside, again, the roof was pretty much gone and it looked really bad. And when I came in, she said, "Look at the integrity of this building." And it was solid. It was old-time construction. The 2x4s were actually 2x4, and the cement was just all intact, no cracks, nothing. And so in the discussion, we all decided that we were going to write some grants and refurbish it and make it a museum visitor center for the purposes of not only educating our young people about all our history, but also the greater community. One of the biggest issues in regards to the delays that were here, and we had to make sure that I was the first one to go up and down it in case it didn't break. Everything's the chairman's fault. The rain, the cold, everything. And so I make sure that when Bertha and B were riding in the elevator, I went with them just to make sure. So, but anyway, let's give Faith a huge round of applause here.
I've been in this building for months now, and when I first came here, there was nothing here but a chair, and not a table nice like that, but a little table. And so I would sit at that little table and look out the window and see everybody going by, and I swear to God, there were children laughing in this. I could hear children laughing. I could hear people walking in the basement. I heard noises all the time. And I thought, do I want to be here? And it took a while, and all of those sounds stopped for me, so I don't hear them anymore. But what I hear is, there's a sense of comfort that's here when I'm here. There's a sense of being where we should be. That this is, and I hadn't thought about the building being renovated as being, although I did go to school here, as being so important, but being here now, it has to be here. And all of us have a role in figuring out what it is that we have to give, whether it's stories or pictures, interviews, some work, coming to volunteer, just coming and having coffee and sitting down and visiting. Those are all things that are important. So this
Sure. And I want to thank Chairman Isham, who I've known for over 20 years and had the joy of doing a lot of projects with. You've made me extremely proud twice in the last 2 weeks. And one is obviously the opening of this museum and visitor center. But the other was a picture that was sent to me last week of Chairman Isham in Washington, D.C. at a very hoity-toity event. It was the National Tribal Conference. And he was at a press conference. It's got the White House banner behind him, and he was wearing a Green Bay Packers shirt. So that was the second time. But,
came in here this morning. I anticipated there would be some alumni of the students who went to school here, or relatives of people who were here, and people who were familiar with the Kinnamon School, both here and about a mile from here, kitty corner through this square up here. The first Kinnamon School, of course, was up on the corner Fromo Road and Round Lake School Road up there, just north of the Head Start building. And if you go up there, I took my history class up there and we played around in the trees there now, the big trees that are growing up, in the footstep and the foundation of the old Kinnamon School. And if you go there, there's still the basement. You still can see the big thick slabs of the basement walls, and the thing has caved in, and people have removed some of the timbers and the wood that was there. But years ago, back in the early 50s, you could still see remnants of that building, and that was pretty prominent. And there's some people here who remember that building. I want to talk about education, and I sure want to talk about Kinnamon, but we have to put it in the context of what was going on the reservation and why was there a public school in the middle of the reservation. In an era in which the Bureau of Indian Affairs pretty much controlled the livelihood of education, either through their direct federal expenditures into BIA boarding schools or even BIA day schools, but also they encouraged states to support students who attended public schools. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, and that's really the premise under which Kinnamon School was constructed, both up there and here, and why it maintained its livelihood up into the 1960s. I didn't learn all this stuff by accident. I had a lot of teachers, and as I traveled around the reservation back in the late 60s and 70s and even the 80s, I spent a lot of time with elders who attended these schools, not only here, but in New Post, in Whitefish, and Reserve. We have a real history of schools here on this reservation. And the schools, a Presbyterian school up in Round Lake, we've got the St. Francis Salinas School, which has a real history down in Reserve, and we had a school facility over across Reserve on the north side. It used to be Old Reserve, on the Neoshin. It was the peninsula over there, across the lake. That's really where things were begun on this reservation over there, on that peninsula. And so that's really was the center of life for a time, before we lost it. And that gets us into a lot of history of how we lost property and how we lost land and how the reservation was situated here and how we lost our resource and our timber and so on. And that's all part of the story of education here. Because for Lac Courte Oreilles, education is nothing more than a dynamic of acculturation, social acculturation, which means that we're transformed. We need to transform these native children as quickly and efficiently as possible in the least amount of time. Now that might seem like a pretty negative way of looking at it, but in the course of things in Wisconsin history, you know, that was a real practical objective, is to get Native Americans acculturated or Americanized. And so schools were really the answer. And it wasn't just a matter of boarding schools, but in Wisconsin and Minnesota, very early on, before Johnson O'Malley, tribes were beginning to send their kids to public schools more than you'd seen anywhere else in the United States. Looking at our reservation, understanding that our schools were simply mechanisms to transform Native kids into ideal Americans, Americanizing our population as soon as possible, and giving them the skills and the tools to then go out and independently charge up and join the mainstream population of America. So that was the ultimate goal. And we just didn't understand, probably back in 1920, we didn't understand the process that was going on around us. And pretty much the natives back then were, as some anthropologists would describe who came to Lac Courte Oreilles to study the transformation of natives from the 17th century into the 20th century. They were describing Native Americans as politically impotent, meaning that we really didn't know politically what was going on around us, even though we were receiving an education, even though our people were transforming from native clothing from the 19th century to modern civilized dress. Gentlemen's clothing, they used to describe the ideal. And so the Indian agent down there, the sub-agent down in reserve, was being evaluated on the percentage of families that he could get to transform from buckskin to clothing, to regular textile clothing. That was the evaluation process. So you can see that if we educate the children, then the chances are those adults then are probably going to change from buckskin to textile. So that's kind of the way things were seen back then. And so that's why we used to call, up until about 1961, we described the Indian agent down in that other Kinnamon building down in Reserve, we described him as the farmer. In fact, we addressed him as the farmer. And he ran the tribal council meetings back then in the 50s and early 60s. He actually ran the meetings, and it was down in the basement of that building. And everybody referred to me because Wisconsin and Minnesota Indian tribes were ahead in the model to transform kids. We had a lead on it. And so we were about 3 or 4 steps ahead in both states, Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so we became the guinea pig of moving kids from boarding schools into nearby public schools. And in this case, building public schools right on the reservation, separate and apart from Hayward and Winter over this way. So that's why we were here. That's why we were here until the 1960s. And then in the 1960s, of course, Hayward was consolidating all of their small primary schools that were located in places out in over there by Stone Lake. You had a couple. You had some up there by Spider Lake. You had one here. You had New Post, and we had public school elementary one-room schools, and in this case 2-room schools, all over the place. And finally the district just could no longer afford to keep heating these smaller buildings. And so they consolidated, of course, into Hayward. Photos of Dick, of your younger brothers, Don and Tom over here. And I know you were here. And I see other people in the room who went to school here, and you know, their experiences are really that of wonderful. I never had a school so great as Kinnamon. It was really super here. My teacher was both Mrs. Williams and Mrs. Garbutt over in that room, and I just really used to think back. When I finally had to go to Hayward, I thought back on the things I missed, you know, in being able to go to school here. They had some outdoor playground things. They had teeter-totters over here. And they also had I don't know what you call that contraption, but it was a giant metal pole up here. And at the top, they had this thing that went like this. And you could like hang on to that thing, and then somebody would run, and all the kids would be flying. We'd be flying out straight like this. You know, and I just think of the liability today, the insurance liability I mean, we were flying like these of the real things you learned about the sense of tribal family and the sense of being together and growing up knowing each other. And so it was a great time. When I saw this building falling into ruin, I just felt so bad. And then when I heard and learned that they were going to preserve it as a historic artifact, I just can't tell you how great that made me feel. And I take my hat off to anybody. You know, Bookie was involved, and Mick, and a whole bunch of other people who had a hand in getting this thing preserved. This has got some real history, and we'll get that history recorded so that we can have a fond memory. But we should need to record the whole history of education here at Lac Courte Oreilles.